Tits and Tea, y'all.
Welcome back to Tits and Tea.
Whoop, whoop.
Cheers.
Cheers. This is our what episode?
This is episode number 7.
God, lucky 7.
Yep.
And today we're going to be talking about actors, whores, and thieves. This is going to be a very loosey-goosey episode. We mostly just want to give some historical and cultural context to the sometimes inextricable link between actors and prostitutes. Seemingly going back
through most of human
history,
and in a lot, if not all, world cultures.
Yeah, it's eerie, and so we would like to go on after this episode to do kind of a series about famous courtesans throughout history and their impact on society.
Yeah.
And one of the things you're going to see in common with a lot of them is that they are actors, dancers, opera singers.
Yeah, that they did more than just the prostitution thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at least one or two of them, especially in further back history, I think were just prostitutes or whores in the colloquial term.
Mm-hmm.
Not what would eventually be considered courtesans. But we'll get into all of the terminology.
We'll bring it down for you.
Yeah. So, like we said, like Talia eloquently said already, there's been a lot of connections between performing artists of all sorts and sex work throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
Largely, I would suspect, because they're both some of the oldest professions in the world.
Some of the oldest professions. They're professions where women are in the public gaze, whereas normally you would not be seen out and about without a husband or a chaperone. You were meant to really be inside. If you were out and about, you were under some sort of protection.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that whether you were a dancer, a singer, an actor, you were on stage, seemingly to parade yourself around in view of the public eye. You would have to sometimes kiss other actors, or as we'll go into wear certain things that were more revealing than what was culturally acceptable at the time.
Yep.
Leading to them being objectified, which has not changed.
No. It also was often not just a social standing sort of disdain for actors, but also a moral or even intellectual one.
Yes.
In terms of ancient Greece, Plato is known to have railed against actors because he saw it as a mimetic art.
Yeah.
And ultimately was just the art of lies, and so was disdainful. And then, there's also a lot of history, especially according to one of the resources that I looked at in particular talked about how the word whore in a lot of history, at least the English word whore specifically, did not always mean exactly what it means today of there having been an exchange of money or goods
for sexual favors.
Yeah, for sexual services. But rather was just anyone of seen to have loose morals,
which is a very loose
definition. And that's applicable to a wide range of people, and also very easily applied to all sorts of performers.
You're a whore. I'm a whore. My cat's a whore.
Yeah, anyone who just did not follow societal norms could be called a whore, essentially. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. But
as well,
yeah, a lot of the people that we are going to be talking about in the upcoming series, though, were actually prostitutes, actual whores.
There was sex.
And courtesans. There were, yes, they were sex workers.
They did the thing. Because one of the first things that we wanted to talk about is, at least that I wanted to talk about, was the fact that, like, you know, in ancient Greece, we know from, okay, so I'm going to start a little bit earlier. We know from movies, from, like, whether it's Staged Beauty or it's Shakespeare in Love, that women were not allowed to be actresses, and oftentimes that men would play a female role until their voice broke, so on and so forth. That's all very well known. I was really curious about when it became illegal for a woman to become an actor, which I could not find. What I could find is that in ancient Greece, it was illegal for a woman to be an actor. In Rome, it was accepted, but actors were part of, I put this down here. I read it to Chloe and she wrote it down. It was called infamy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Which is where I would guess the word infamous comes from.
Yeah.
But infamy was a special class of people in Rome. It consisted of prostitutes, singers, musicians, actors, gladiators, and slaves. They did not have the same rights as normal women citizens. They were not allowed to hold office. They were not allowed to testify in court. And they were subject to insane punishments, which I think is kind of interesting, especially looking at how we view. A lot of them were famous. You know, like they had renown in a social sphere, but they weren't taken very seriously, which I think is interesting to see that we really haven't changed that point of view when it comes to entertainers. Whether you're a sports star or you're a sports star, you're an actor, you're a musician. A lot of times it's just kind of like, well, that's all you are, and like, you don't get to talk about this. Like, shut up and go to your corner.
Oh yeah, I mean, even today there's a lot of people who, out of hand, will just dismiss even current day celebrities with the assumption that there's a certain level of inherent frivolity or like airheadedness to them, simply because what they do is an art form career, not like some real career.
You're not a surgeon.
Completely ignoring the fact that like a lot of them are like very well educated, like master's degree holders, doctorates. Like
a lot of them nowadays also come from wealthier families.
Yeah.
So,
and like, you know, there's, you know, like Jodie Foster comes to mind. Like she's extraordinarily well educated.
Or Natalie
Portman. Even like Angelina Jolie, who was a wild child,
it's not
like found her calling and passion and is very educated now in the things that matter to her and in her callings, like as a UN ambassador and working around the world with people. It's not this exclusive thing.
It's not
black and white. Yeah, it's definitely not black and white.
Life is gray. It's multitudes shades of gray.
Also, while a lot of people think because of there's a part of me that wants to say, because of like, you know, the colonial programming that we have essentially, and the fact that like most of the media that we consume really exclusively focuses on the European histories and white history in particular.
Oh yeah.
It's very common for people to assume that that was the truth everywhere. Or to assume that that's just all of history, that there wasn't a whole rest of the planet that also had its own cultures and rules and laws and histories.
Wait. You're telling me that there's other places besides Europe?
I know, go figure, right?
Shocking.
Like wild. And so, yes, while there was a large chunk of history in which it was illegal for women to be actors in Europe, the original kabuki theater in Japan centuries and centuries ago was all female. There were no male kabuki actors. That was not a thing. Granted, it was also often associated with prostitution because most of the kabuki actresses were also often for sale. Largely because it was how they also then kept the theaters going.
Yeah, it's great funding.
You know, and depending on, like, the particular era of history we're talking about, like, if it's, you know, feudal lords and things like that, there's definitely also large swaths of the planet that, like, if the guy in power decides he wants you, and you're in the lower class, you don't get to say no.
You either submit or you die.
Yeah. And, like, if they do that by coming to your boss, so, like, if you're in a theater company and the person who runs that area comes to your boss and is like, I want her.
Yeah.
He can't say no.
No. Even just look at King Henry VIII going after, oh my gosh, Catherine Parr.
Yeah.
Who was married at the time, had a son. He decides, oh no, I want you. She has to divorce her husband, leave her son behind, and go and become queen. She didn't get to say, like, no, sorry, Henry, like, I saw what you did to your other wives. I'm not interested. It was, you either do this or I will probably kill your family.
Exactly.
And kill you last.
There were
may not have been explicitly said, but heavily implied.
So, like, probably surprising no one, at least no one who would be watching our channel.
Yes.
But what we're getting at with this particular arc is that while there is obviously a connection between actors and prostitutes throughout history in terms of, like, public view and, like, anti-acting sentiment, in particular as it pertains to women, because let's be honest, historically there was a lot less policing of men. Historically and currently, there's a lot less policing of men in terms of what is considered appropriate or not for them. That said, like, male actors were also still seen as part of the lower class, but they were not treated in quite the same way as the females.
Even look at Carson in Downton Abbey and how ashamed he is that he was a stage performer. Like, even up into the 20th century, right, like, what, 8 years before we really get what we think of as, like, the golden age of Hollywood starting in the 1920s, that shame still lingers. And it's really not until celebrity culture starts to blossom in the early 1920s with stars like Clara Bow, where they're also able to be used as a living advertisement for companies that we see to this day, that you start to get this image of being a cat, of being a cat. Of being an actress started to be seen as, like, glamorous and something that you would aspire
its
to
own
be.
Commodity, even. Really is
the idea of being a star. You're not a...
Get a little lipstick on that too.
Thank you. That is a good friend. Is it gone?
Get you. It's like one little dot at the end of your tooth.
Oh,
it's because you have, like, long-staying lipstick. I think it was like a drop of it.
Just leave it. Just leave it. Leave
like
me
a freckle
alone
on your tooth.
Gross.
Okay, so...
But going past that, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the idea of, because being an artist was so prominent and you were in the public eye, that a lot of people who are history buffs know this, but, like, going to the theater, going to the ballet, the opera, was not what we would do today. Today, if you get tickets to go to a ballet, a theater production, the opera, etc., you're going to view a piece of art. You're expecting to go and be moved, whereas through most of history, the art wasn't ever really appreciated until the artist was dead, for one. But also, these public spaces were places where people went to see others and be seen. You wouldn't be sitting in a theater watching the actors, you would be looking to see who else was there. You'd be gossiping. You'd be noting who's with whom.
Yeah.
It was as much I want to say almost like a marketplace of sorts, especially when it came to the artists that were on stage. The Opera Garnier, when it was built, had in a special room, which was common
in the Paris Opera Ballet.
But this was one that they have discussed in multiple references that we've read. It was a very special room that was built as a place for dancers to warm up, quick change, and it was someplace that if you had seasonal tickets, you could go backstage, and seasonal tickets were only a man
for
would
the
have
wealthy.
money to be able to. You'd be a wealthy man. You would be able to go and watch the dancers warm up, get undressed, have their quick changes.
Yeah,
you would go
like
and be
a
able.
Special foyer that
it's a special foyer just for them, and it had their own special entrance as well that was hidden from the rest of the theater.
And this was particularly infamous at the Paris Opera Garnier, the opera ballet, because it was such a well-known relationship between these wealthy patrons who would buy time with the ballerinas. Like, they would spend the night with them, they would purchase them, and they could also go and, like, preview the wares in the foyer. But they even had a term for them. They were the abonnés. And, like, everyone understood the ballerina abonné, like, dynamic. And it was part of the system that was that ballet company for a long time.
Because most opera houses, every opera house for a very long time had a ballet corps. Mm-hmm. The ballet corps would dance twice during an opera. And it was really an important part because when you weren't a wealthy person going into the opera. You weren't a wealthy young woman going in to become a ballerina. You were starving, you were poor, your parents were either dead or they could not afford you. And so you were sent to the ballet to train and to earn your keep. You would start off when you were fairly young, especially for ballet. Like, you would start usually around 5. By 10, it was considered to be a little too late. For your muscles to be formed in the correct way. It's still seen that way to this day. But you would start off as what they would call a ballet rat, where you were a child, and then when you got to around pubescence, 13, 14, I'm sure I'm fucking younger, you could either stay in the ballet corps, or if you had ambition and you wanted to better yourself, you would try to get yourself a patron who you would more than likely, if not in that time and place, but eventually have a sexual relationship with. They would put you up. They would pay your parents fees for any other family members that you had. They would pay for your education, your housing, and they would pay for dance classes and singing lessons, which could stand between you staying in the ballet corps forever and making essentially what we would consider today a minimum wage. Or you could have this exchange with let's be real, an older rich gentleman who could set you up to have the experience and skill to launch yourself into a career where you could make more money, and like find your fame, as you would say. And it was the only way, and it has been really the only way for a very, very, very long time. And we even see echoes of it today.
Yeah.
It is what it is. The casting couch is real, y'all.
It is. There's also, and this is part of where the real distinction, I think, started to transition between the levels of prostitute.
Yes.
Slash performer. Was really in, like, the 18th century in terms of Europe.
Was when we first started to see the categories broken down.
One, just as, like, a a note of interest to me, the official use of the word prostitute wasn't even written down in, like, a publication until, like, the late 1600s. I think I actually have the specific year.
Oh, sorry. I flipped the page.
Okay. The Old Bailey Session Papers in 1685 was the first, like, publication of the word prostitute. It didn't really become commonly used until late 18th
They
century.
would use, like, harlot,
Bod, mall,
yeah,
whore, but also, like, in the sense of, like, any woman with loose morals, whore. You know?
Everybody's a whore.
But also, prior to the 18th century, really, a little bit in, like, the late 1600s, but primarily in the early 18th century is when you start seeing the shift from theater being for the common person, like, for everyone, and the, like, raucous, dirty, like, standing room only of, like, insanity that it was, into what it eventually became and what we mostly think of it as now, of being this luxury, and becoming a thing for the aristocracy, essentially. And it was because of certain playwrights like Shakespeare and Moore and these writers and performers who managed to become sort of darlings
of the aristocracy. It's not just straight up the monarch.
And the royal court.
Yeah.
And so they became, like, working for them, essentially. And so because of that, you started seeing more and more of, like, actresses who, yes, they were still seen as having loose morals because of flirting with the audience, because of doing things like breeches roles, where, like, in, like, 12th Night, when, like, she has to dress like a woman, or, like, a woman is dressing like a man, and, like, passing herself off.
Yeah.
You know, it was not normal to be able to see a woman's legs
or their shape
at all.
They would be wearing a farthingale and a hoop skirt and all sorts of stuff.
Like, the ideal female shape for public was very exaggerated and created through, like, layers and frills and accessories and, like, structures.
To hide the human body.
And so those things were all part of that sense of, like, looseness associated with actors. But a lot of actresses especially developed the skill of mimicking the aristocracy, of being able to play the elegant lady.
Yeah.
And came to have that same social status because they were so well beloved by their rich patrons and fans, essentially. There were still actresses that also did the complete opposite and leaned into being, like, the crass body starlet.
It's always the maid. It's always the maid.
Don't get us wrong. Like, they definitely were there.
They're the most fun roles, for one.
But this is also a time in England, in particular, and in London, when prostitution was so common that there was actually one historian that, like, there's some debate amongst historians, let me put it that way, as to, like,
how
the exact numbers. There's one record that suggests as many as 62,500 prostitutes were in London in 1728, which would have been about 8% of the population. It was also common enough that for quite a long time, even though it wasn't technically legal, it wasn't persecuted often unless the prostitute in question became associated with some other crime, often thievery. Hence, prostitutes and thieves. Because it did inevitably happen. You know, when there's poverty, when there's
Desperate
urgent
times
need.
call for desperate measures, okay?
You get crime. That's what happens.
Yeah.
But that's its own subject.
As its own subject, we're not going to get into that. But there's I thought before when we were talking about the different classifications of prostitution, you brought up a really interesting fact that I didn't know, is that like it really started to become these very clear tiers towards the same time, towards the 1720s, and going forward, where you had, or if you were like, you know, to be watching a film today, or if anybody here's ever watched Harlots, you know, you have the whores that are working on the streets, they're fucking in alleyways, they're fucking on the ground.
They often sleep outside.
They're sleeping outside. There's a lot of venereal disease.
Exactly, all of that.
You know, I'm sure these are probably an issue. It's a thing.
They were the ones that were streetwalkers, that were
the ones
definitely whores.
Yeah.
Referred to in those terms, like the less gracious term would definitely apply to that level of prostitute. And then you have the next tier up, which are girls that are still walking the streets to get their johns. Yeah. But they're renting rooms from like a mother or a like mistress, like a madam, essentially. More freelance. But yeah, they have to pay rent to use the rooms. But yeah, they're still going out. They're getting their dudes and then taking them back to their rented room and like sharing the profits essentially to have a space to work in. And then you have brothels of varying different reputations. Yeah, where the ladies actually, and where the ladies could advertise their services apparently in periodicals. Like they would actually put out advertisements for their services with reviews as well, which I find so fucking entertaining. Could you imagine like a book going around now? I mean, now we have porn star awards, but like I don't know the name of those awards. I know that they have them, but I don't know the name for them. Sorry to any of my friends that are in the industry. I should know that. But could you imagine? I mean, we do. We have like awards for like best blowjob, best. I don't. Yeah, there's. So you get the idea. The imagination can go on. So you had that level, and then the top tier, which they do actually show really well in Harlots. They show just to reference a show. Like they explore this tier system really, really well. It's definitely like a fictionalized story, obviously for dramatic effect, but a lot of good like historical content and some real historical figures in there. Like Harriet, who was the first black madam in London. So yeah, highly recommend both of us that show. Watch it. It's but the top tier was the prostitutes that essentially graduated to kept mistress. Yeah. Who became we would courtesans today, where they are, you know, not only do they have a patron like a lot of the brothel women did, but they no longer see other patrons. They just see that one. They are his whore. I love it. They're his whore. I mean, you were though, and I think. But they were also known for having a higher level of education, of being able to put on the same airs and decorum of the aristocracy, so that they could be out and about with him and be more respectable. They weren't like super respectable, but some of them, but they were accepted by society as long as you were with someone that was of high enough social standing. It was a distinction from like you weren't a prostitute that was being like rutted upon in an alleyway. You were usually they would usually pay for your education, and in certain cultures, you were the only women that were allowed to be educated and go into public spaces of learning with men, like libraries. Also, it's one of those things where a lot of women at the time, like you spoke multiple different languages. You knew how to paint, you knew how to dance, you could sing, you could play music or read music. You could compose poetry, exactly, and compose it. And so these women either were taught or taught themselves these mannerisms that allowed them to move in society, and everyone knew what they were, but they could hide it well enough
that it was known and accepted, but as long as you weren't like making a show of yourself or embarrassing your patron, you were good.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, especially considering how marriage was, you would more oftentimes see a man with his mistress of choice, his kept woman, than you ever would with his actual wife.
Especially in a lot of the things he would do in his leisure time.
Yeah.
Because it would be
The
less
wife-
appropriate for the wife to be there.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They couldn't go to gambling houses with
Yeah.
him. They couldn't go to boxing matches. They couldn't go to the races. There were so many restrictions for a married woman at the time, and whereas
What was
marriage
appropriate
was
for them.
seen as we got married for either political or financial gain or stability. You are there to sire my heirs.
Yeah.
And you stay out in the countryside, or you stay in this house on the other side of town, and I get to do whatever I want with whomever I want for the rest of the time. Yeah, which is sometimes, I'm sure, a blessing and a curse, depending on
Depending on the marriage.
Depending on the marriage.
Yeah.
But I think it's one of those things where it's not a surprise that we get so much overlap, because a lot of the women that we will be talking about in this series did work as artists in one form or another, and oftentimes met their first patrons, whether they are painters who immortalize them, which was definitely on the rarer side, or usually their cup of tea was corrupting princes of the blood. Which, I mean, good for you. It's not.
Yeah.
All the glory days for that are gone.
You know, some gained a lot of social standing, including like top tier social standing. It's going to be really. It's going to be a fun series, yeah.
Where they were even, they would take over sometimes, depending on which monarch they were shacked up with. Sometimes they would put them in charge, like when they were away to war. Like they would necessarily be like, okay, like the queen's in charge, but like really, their mistress is the one that's sitting in on council meetings.
Yeah.
Or is allowed to actually ride into battle with them and see everything firsthand.
Yeah.
I think something that Chloe and I have discussed is that we don't really, obviously in our society, prostitution is illegal. Sex work is very frowned upon. There's a huge stigma that still goes with it. It's something that has always been there, and I hope one day it will fade, or that we'll be able to have some sort of reconciliation between this moral standing and human sexuality, which is a base need, and by God, it's one of the oldest perfections, and like if somebody is strong enough to be able to do it, then fucking let them. For one, like, I don't think it should be an issue, but one of the things that we see a lot today is, you're not going to have a woman, for the most part, who's going to say that they're a courtesan, but what's very accepted today is the idea of being a sugar baby. Yeah. Where, just like being a courtesan, your deal with this person is not necessarily, you're not necessarily being like, okay, like, give me $20 for a blowjob. Yeah. It's more of, you pay my rent, you pay me per date, you pay my school tuition, whatever. There is a financial transaction that's happening for a very non-specific relationship that, if we're all just being freaking honest, includes sex. Yeah. Because you're not paying somebody $500 for a dinner without there being something on the other side that you could not be getting for free. Yeah. I think it's something that people are more accepting of today, which is what gives me hope, honestly, for like sex work. The fact that like strippers in Hollywood are starting to unionize. The fact that you were telling me the other day that I know that porn stars are fighting to become a part of SAG-AFTRA so they can have like proper protections when they're on set.
Yeah, one of the articles I wrote was
that you read. Yeah, or that you wrote.
that I read.
Are you moonlighting, Chloe?
I mean, I am, but not on this article. So one of the articles that I read in exploring, you know, the historical contexts of the association between sex work and performing artists and actors in particular, was written by a sex worker. And they discussed how, as a larger part of, or as a part of the larger conversation that is definitely happening nowadays around the legalization and legitimizing of sex work, the fact that it's not going away, it never will.
It never will. It's been here forever.
There has always been a demand for it. There will always be a demand for it. And regardless of what some percentage of the population feels about that, it doesn't change that fact. And because of that, it should be normalized. It should be legalized so that there are protections in place, so that there is regulations in place.
The provider.
And yes, part of that, as an extension of that, there's a lot of sex workers, particularly in, and more specifically in the porn industry, that are making the argument that not only is this something that should be regulated and legalized, but that they should also be acknowledged for being the performers that they are. That there is, you know, sure, if you're talking like lower level, like amateur type stuff, no, there's not really a lot of acting that's happening in that.
No.
But like, for like real full-time paid porn stars,
the ones that you see everywhere that like have done things like Entourage,
right? And that
point.
like do like the old like Skinamax type,
like
things,
softcore,
like softcore, even like all of that. There's a story involved. There's acting. They are actors. They happen to do the actual physical act as opposed to using an intimacy coordinator and like shielding and whatnot. But otherwise, there's still acting. There's still performance. Even in the actual intimacy, there's considerations of like what angles are they in, what positions are they in to best achieve the desired effect.
Takes of the same thing.
It's the same job ultimately, but with added risks. And they are arguing that they should have that acknowledged so that they can get the same considerations and protections that we're offering the rest of actors and performers in the world.
And whether you think that they should join SAG-AFTRA as a union is neither here or there. What it really just boils down to is the fact that people who choose to do sex work need to be protected. They are usually the most vulnerable to all forms of abuse. And people seem to get after moral high ground and realize that people are human and that this demand is not going to go away. And if anything, the constant judgment and demonization of it has made the demand for it grow exponentially.
Yes, because which is in a way that is completely just human nature. That which is taboo is extra desirable. Mm-hmm. Like when you tell yourself you don't get to have the sugar, what do you want all the time? The sugar. Like it's the same psychology. Normalizing it to some degree, legalizing it, all of those things, if anything, would actually have the effect that so many are hoping for, of there being less of it.
And there's plenty of other countries that have very well organized and protected sex worker, I don't even know the word, but like environments for them where it's taxed, it's regulated, they're tested regularly. I can go on and on about this, so I'm not going to, because we may actually have like a decent short video for once. So I'm going to wrap it the hell up. But it has been done.
So with all of this said, obviously there's a long history here. And while today there's a number of our, celebrity figures now, both actors, singers, rappers, etc., models who have done sex work and admitted to it. It's part of like their personal history. There's a lot of historical figures that are fascinating figures that worked as prostitutes, that were courtesans, etc. And it's going to be a really fun series going into it with you guys. So definitely stay tuned. The next number of episodes will likely be shorter because we're going to be focusing on a specific one per episode.
And it'll be more historical education as well as going into their influences on society at the time.
Yeah. And how you might still see some of those influences today, etc.
Yeah. And some will be going back as far as ancient Greece, and some of them will be a little bit more modern, a la some famous scream siren that I can't remember the name of. Oh dear.
Oh dear.
I wonder who it could possibly be. I really wish I found. Next time.
Stay tuned. It's going to be a good time. Thanks for joining us again.
Bye. One more.
Cheers, guys.